Okay, the Women Who Code Philadelphia team, we have 3 directors. Myself, Alicia, I am a senior software developer in the Philadelphia area. I just left my last job at Nordstrom in July so that I could take a month off to sort of reposition myself, and I'm looking forward to new opportunities next month. One of our other directors, Megan, is she on the call? Okay, I don't see her. She's a business systems analyst. She's been in Philadelphia for quite a while, and I think she's been involved in the women in tech community quite a bit. She'll be leading an event next week, I think, on how to be an anti-racist book club. I've been reading through the book. It's great. I highly recommend it. Our other director is Becca Hashi. She is a VP of Technology Solutions. She's been doing a great job finding guest speakers for tech startups and career development. Becca is not on the call tonight either. And feel free to reach out to any of us. You can email us at philadelphia@womenwhocode.com. We're in Slack channels. We're in Philly Dev. We're all happy to meet you. So let's talk about Women Who Code a little bit. Our mission is to inspire women to excel in technology careers. And our vision is to have a world where women are represented in all levels of the technical profession. So engineers, directors, VPs, founders. We have a code of conduct. We are dedicated to being an inclusive community. If you would like to find out more about the code of conduct, there's you can go to the womenwhocode.com where there's a link to the code of conduct. Let me just paste that into the chat in case anyone is particularly interested in that. If anything ever makes you feel uncomfortable or you see something that you're concerned about, feel free to reach out to one of us, or there's a contact form at that link. On a final note, Women Who Code is committed to ensuring that they are an anti-racist organization and recognize the power of our platform to be a force that affects change. We ask that you join us in finding ways to speak out for racial justice, share your stories when you are able, and take care of yourselves and others. To find out more about our support for inclusivity and Black Lives Matter, you can check out the blog link that I'm going to post in the chat. All right, moving on to the technical part. Well, I say the technical, non-technical part of technical interviews. I'm going to do a quick overview of what the technical job finding process looks like. As you might expect, you typically find jobs by applying to them through job sites like Glassdoor, Indeed, Hired, or through networking on LinkedIn, Slack, networking events. Once a recruiter has identified you as a candidate that they want to find out more about, they will call you or they'll send you an email or sometimes a link to book time on their calendar for about a 30-minute call. That's the call we're going to talk about today. Once you've gone through the initial recruiter screen, you'll often move on to a second round, or I say second round, but it's really the first technical round. This might be an online coding challenge, a technical phone screen, or a take-home coding project. These are the 3 most common types of technical assessments I've seen, but there are more types out there and it really depends on the company. Once you've passed through the technical screen, or at least the first type of technical interview, there are a couple different options. You can be taken in for a full day on-site. People call it that, but it's 4 to 5 interviews back to back that are more technical coding, sometimes soft skills, depends on the role you're looking at. In some cases, they look at your technical screen and they go into a soft skills interview. Soft skills is often a misnomer, but what they're really looking for is, are you a good communicator? Are you a leader? Will you be a good fit for the team? Occasionally, they do the full day on-site and then soft skills, or soft skills and the full day on-site. And in some cases, they do 1 technical screen, 1 soft skills, and then go straight to negotiations. There's a lot of flexibility. Once you get the job, pass your interviews, I say get the job, you go into offer negotiation, where you go through paperwork, you review the terms of employment, and you talk about compensation. After that, then there's the real just signing, immigration, background check, references, and you finally have a job. So ideally, I will be covering all of these different rectangles over the next few months. If anyone has a topic that they are particularly interested in or concerned about, let me know, and I can definitely bump it up to the top of my plan. Does anyone have any questions about that sort of technical interview layout or where this initial recruiter call fits in? Okay. All right, so reiterating the title. Your career is flashing before your eyes. What to cover in the fast-paced initial recruiter call? This is usually a 30-minute call, and you have to cover a lot. So first, you're talking about your past, which is your experience and your resume. Then your present. You talk about your current skill set and the ideal job you want right now. Finally, you look at your future. Where do you want this job to take you? And where do you envision your career maybe 2 to 3 years from now at this position? And then you'll have time to ask any questions you might have about the position or the company. On the other side, your recruiter is going to tell you about the company, about the interview process, and the position information. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail into each of these circles. Why does this call matter? When I first started out interviewing, I thought that this was just a way for recruiters to make sure that you were an actual human being and that you had in fact written your own resume. But there's a little bit more to it as I've gone through many more of these calls. First off, for you, you can learn about the role expectations. This isn't just what's in the job description. It can be things like you'll be on call, or you'll have this many reports, or you'll be expected to do open source development. Sometimes those things aren't in the job description and they do affect what you'll actually be doing. You'll also have a chance to learn about the company. This means things like, is this company socially responsible? Do they support diversity? If there are things that are important to you that might be deal breakers, this is your chance to find out sooner rather than later. Probably one of the most important things is you're going to find out how you'll be interviewed and along what timeline. Certain companies are infamous for having really long interview processes, particularly some of the FAANG companies, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google. You definitely want to know if you're looking at a hire 2 months out versus 2 weeks out. You'll be able to request benefits information. Sometimes recruiters will tell you this verbally over the call, or they'll send you a few PDFs that tell you about health benefits, 401k, and any other company perks. And finally, you can find out who you'll be working with. So the recruiter also has a lot that they want to get out of this conversation. They want to know if you're a skill match. So they've probably seen your resume, but they want to make sure that the skills you have, you're able to articulate them in a way that matches the role, along with the right level of experience. You can say you're a Python developer, but they might want to know how many years, or some of them ask from a scale of 1 to 8, how do you rate your proficiency? Why is it 1 to 8? I'm not really sure. They want to know if you're interested in the company. Yes, in some cases, you're applying to a job because you just want a job. But companies really want employees that are at least a little bit invested, because that typically makes a better employee and produces better work. So trying to show a little bit of interest helps. The final thing that they want to assess is whether they think you'll be able to pass the interview. Recruiters are often non-technical, so they really aren't evaluating you in a technical sense. They typically have a list of criteria a little more extensive than the job description. And they want to make sure that they're not wasting your time and they're not wasting the company time. This doesn't mean you don't qualify. It might be, well, they meet 5 out of 10, but they really need this one, which probably means they wrote the job description poorly, but that's a different topic. Or they might find out they want 5 years of experience in Python, but you only have 2. So sometimes it might be a mismatch, and it's better to find out early rather than spending 2 weeks and 6 hours interviewing. So let's talk a little bit more about what you're going to say. So the recruiter will ask you some questions, but sometimes you can sort of give a good summary of yourself so that they don't have to ask as many, or you sort of answer what they're looking for ahead of time. First, we start with your past. You want to have an idea of your 5 to 10 top skills. They don't have to be your best skills, but you kind of want to look at skills that are matching the job description and maybe skills that are in demand right now. So keep those in mind. You'll want to be ready to answer questions about your resume. Now, when I talk about answering questions about your resume, it might be something like, oh, you said that you've built a project on AWS. Tell me how you automated that. It could be like that. You know, they're looking for an answer like CloudFormation or Terraform. But it could also be things like, why did you leave job A to go to job B? Or I noticed you have a 3-month gap in your resume. Can you tell me what you did during that time? Some of these questions can be a little off-putting if you haven't prepared to answer them, so just keep that in mind. When you do talk about yourself, you're probably going to focus on projects, or at least I recommend that you focus on projects. So for example, you can tie together all of your skills, and in addition to a lot of soft skills and leadership, by putting it in a single, concise, nice sort of elevator pitch. So for example, I might be a Java developer that says, you know, Java, Spring Boot, Kafka, AWS, Kubernetes. That's what I do. While that does do a keyword match and makes it easier for the recruiter to know what I can and can't do, that doesn't provide much value over my resume. Instead, I can talk about how I designed and implemented a backend service with a team of 5 engineers over the course of 1.5 years to deliver a $1 million saving project using Java Spring Boot on AWS Kubernetes using event-driven architecture with Kafka that integrated with the rest of the company. This also resulted in me writing an engineering standard for the company to use on how to integrate with Kafka. Now, I added a lot more skills there. This is a concise story. This helps them understand not just the skills you have, but the context. It's not just that I'm a Java Spring Boot developer, but I actually know how to run services. So that's really important. I used them all in a single project, and I also showed leadership in that project as well. So it can take time to craft that kind of who am I in 2 minutes and what have I delivered in a way that gets your skills together, shows that you're a leader and can communicate. And that's really what makes you look good in this conversation. Finally, if you have any technical community involvement, it's worth mentioning. If you're a member of Women Who Code, or if you're a member of another technical community, you don't have to be a leader. You can say, I'm involved in Women Who Code, because you attend events and you participate in the community. For myself, several recruiters contact me and ask, hey, how can I make my job descriptions more inclusive? Would you like to join our company and help with our diversity initiative? So it is a valuable thing to just be involved and call that out. On the more technical side, you can call out open source projects or any other meetups you might lead, such as Google developers. Moving on from, talking about yourself in the past, you can talk about what you want to do now. Particularly, you want to talk about why you applied to this job and why you're excited about working there. A lot of people might make the mistake to think that they have to say, oh, I love this company that does, automation for garbage pickup. I love garbage. You don't have to say that. You can talk about things that are actually meaningful to you. So for example, I'm applying to this company because they have really great benefits and I want to work for a company that cares about their employees. That doesn't have to do with the company or the technical stack, but you're still talking about why that company is attractive to you. So you want to come up with something that's somewhat truthful and also shows that you are genuinely interested in working there. Moving on, in a similar vein, you want to talk about where you want to go with this job. Most companies want to hire people for more than a couple of months or a couple of years. So you might want to have sort of a plan to say, I want to work at this company. I'm interested in its business. I want to learn these skill sets. I'd love to be great at this. So for example, if you're applying to Airbnb, you might say Airbnb is a leader in web development in some areas, and I'd love to be part of that. I'm joining as a junior developer, or I'm joining in this mid-level position, but I see myself being here and learning for 3 to 5 years. I'd love to make changes in the business or lead change by being a developer there. And so you want to show some level of future investment. You might also say, I'm looking to be a principal engineer in the future, and I believe this company has the opportunity to do that. What you say in this future part really changes depending on where you are in your job, where you are in your career. As a junior engineer, this is less important. Once you get into senior positions, and particularly in leadership positions, You're going to have to focus on why you're interested in the business, how you want to develop the business, and how long you think you'll be there to take care of that. So talking to a CTO, they need to have a business plan for like 5 years in order to go through their interview process. And that's very different than a junior developer saying, you know what, I love JavaScript. You guys are leaders in JavaScript. I want to be here. Let's talk about money. So some recruiters, and they will ask, can you give me your expected salary? So the first answer is no. Don't give them your expected salary. Why shouldn't you do this? Well, one of the problems is even if you do all the market research and you say, you know what, I think, $60,000 a year is the right salary for me. And you say 60,000. And then when you get into negotiation, you think, oh, you know what, I really should have tried 70,000 or 80,000. The recruiters will say, well, you said 60,000 and that's what we put the offer for. Okay, so that's unfortunate. Try not to give that answer. Like, try not to give a single number. If you're not comfortable saying no, which is really abrupt, you can say something like, I'd like to wait until further on in the process to discuss salary. Often that's acceptable. You haven't actually done any technical interviewing. Sometimes they'll want to have this conversation after the first technical screen or even at the offer. You can also say, I would like to review benefits and total compensation before giving a number. When you look at benefits, sometimes healthcare, 401k, stock RSUs, or other perks may contribute to your idea of how you should be compensated. So this is also a good way to avoid giving a salary number in this conversation. Finally, you can also ask, what is the range for this role? Some sites will list a range. So LinkedIn, companies can optionally say what the rate is for that. Women Who Code has an excellent job board where companies are required to put the salary range. And so you can say, can you provide me a range? I accept that range, or that matches my expectations. So again, trying to have the conversation where the recruiter wants to know if they'll be able to offer you compensation or if it's within their accepted range, and different ways that you can address that without actually giving a single number that will box you in during negotiation. And finally, if they really push you for it, you can provide a range and put your target number in the bottom half of that range. So for example, if you want to be paid $100,000 per year, you say, I'll accept a range between 90 and 120. And that way you haven't committed to a single number. There's still some flexibility, but you've communicated to them that you have this expectation. It's still tricky. If you give them a range, you may find out that range was lower. It really depends, this is especially risky when you're moving between cities. So moving from San Francisco to Philadelphia to Austin, they're all very different tech environments. So sometimes you should really just do research here, even though the research won't help you with negotiation at this stage. So what can you ask here that will be useful to you? Now, if you don't have time in the call, the 30 minutes where you just spent 10 minutes talking about yourself and having the recruiter tell you all about the company and the job, you can always follow up with email. So you can find out, what will my team be like? What's the size of the team? Who will my manager be? What is my manager's title? How many people are between me and the CTO? Sometimes if you're working for a small company, you report to the director of engineering, and that's kind of intimidating, but it means that it's a smaller company, which has a very different feel than a large company. You may also find out that you're being hired for a generic role. Companies like Facebook, Amazon, Google, you don't get hired for a team. You're hired in sort of a pool of candidates. That may or may not matter to you. Some people really want to know who they'll be working for, and others are okay with any opportunity because it will give them that growth that they're looking for. You'll also want to ask if there's immigration support, if that's important to you. Almost all the time I get recruiters asking you this in the first call or in the first email, but once in a while it gets forgotten, and it's definitely worth bringing it up ahead of time. Some companies don't offer immigration support or visa sponsorship. Some will offer it after a certain grace period, so it's worth asking. You can ask about things that matter to you in terms of responsible companies. Diversity and inclusion, sustainability, and climate. These are different things that if they matter to you, this is an opportunity to ask and get more info. One other thing about the team and diversity inclusion, you can ask, what is the gender or minority makeup of the team? Some companies will be a little cagey about this, and they'll say, oh, well, you know, we've been working on it. And you're like, okay, well, that probably means that you don't have a lot of diversity. Some companies say it's 50-50, and, you know, the last 3 hires we made were all female. So that's a really great response. And then other companies will say, you'll be the first woman on this team. So I just want you to know that. I'm like, all right, that's, you know, I appreciate that. I'm not really sure what you're trying to communicate, but definitely worth knowing. You can also ask things about how you'll be working. Does this role support work from home? Will you be able to relocate? I've always liked the idea of like larger companies. So working at Amazon or Facebook, they have multiple offices all over the world. I had friends and coworkers use that to their advantage to move to another country, Europe or Australia. And if that's something that's attractive to you, definitely ask about it. These are things where, you know, you can really unashamedly ask for all the perks. And final note on perks, definitely ask for benefits info. I just have that on this slide to have it all together. I know I've said it about 3 times already. And then you can follow up with whatever else is important to you. Once you've got all your questions out and all the discussions done, what happens after? So of course, there's a few different options, the best of which is scheduling the next interview, whatever that may be. The next one is that they have decided not to proceed with your application. This does not mean that you're not qualified. It can mean a lot of different things. So for example, the hiring manager may have changed his requirements, or there was a reorg, or there were furloughs, and, you know, no one has control over that right now. Another one is that there might not have been an exact match with your experience. So they might have listed Python, Java, and Go on the resume, on the job description, and you're mostly a Python developer with some Java and Go, and what they were actually looking for was a Go developer with some Python and Java. That's a bad job description and definitely not your fault, and you're still qualified, so don't take that personally. And then finally, no follow-up. I have rarely had recruiters not follow up just because this is such a competitive industry and they want more developers. Maybe you don't have the right years of experience now, but in a couple of years you will. And they want to make sure that they keep that relationship going with you. But I've also encountered many companies where recruiters were constantly passing me off to a 3rd or 4th recruiter. And sometimes that handoff took 2 or 3 weeks for them to finally get back to me and say, oh, sorry, we failed to follow up with you on this interview. Are you still looking? I'm like, yeah, no, I got a job about 2 weeks ago. You missed it. And so that kind of thing happens a lot. So again, try not to take it personally. There's a lot of turnover. There's a lot of recruiting companies that, you know, are third party. So you may not hear back from them. That's all I've got for talking to recruiters in that initial call. If anyone has any questions about it, just feel free to message them in the chat and I'll get to them. Otherwise, I will move on to hash maps, also known as dictionaries and hash tables, the key values of the ubiquitous key value data structure. I will take a small breath for like a minute to see if any questions come in, and then I will move on. Throughout this, I'll try to keep putting links in the chat about what I'm talking about. So I might be slightly awkward, but hopefully you get the content. Most of the links that I'm sharing are in the meetup as well. But just to make sure, you know, I've got them on my screen and I'll be sharing the slides after, but it's really useless if I'm sharing a screen with a hyperlink because you can't click it. Okay, yeah, so LinkedIn and recruiters and references. So this is a whole interesting topic, actually. So one time, you know, about a year ago, I decided to set up a profile on LinkedIn, Indeed, Glassdoor, and Hired. I went to a bunch of career fairs and recruiting events, and I applied to several jobs through job websites. So maybe applying to Microsoft through the Microsoft website or using Workday for other companies. So I tried a bunch of different ways of applying for jobs. All of them resulted in some level of follow-up. So applying through LinkedIn or Glassdoor, they all work. Sometimes if you try to apply through LinkedIn or Glassdoor, they'll actually link you to the company page. So some companies allow it, some companies don't, but that's been effective. I've also found jobs through being in Slack channels. And if you go to certain Slack channels like Philly Dev or Pi Ladies or Women Who Code, people will post jobs and I find things through there. At my point in my career, and this is going to sound really terrible, but I don't apply to jobs anymore because recruiters reach out to me. Now, that's something, you're like, oh man, that's terrible. How is that helpful to me? Well, what I do is I always talk to recruiters. Sometimes I'll talk to like 3 recruiters in a week with no intention of taking those jobs. And that's something where I keep up my LinkedIn profile, I stay active. So you can use LinkedIn as an application tool, but also as a tool to keep building your network. Every time I talk to a recruiter, even though I'm not going to take the position, they add me as a connection on LinkedIn and I become visible to other recruiters. So there's a few different ways you can use LinkedIn and a few different ways you can sort of make yourself visible and also apply. So hopefully that helps. Though there are differences between what types of jobs you'll find on each platform. And I encourage you to check out Hired just as a, interesting way. Hired, you set up your application and then you wait for recruiters to message you. It's a bit interesting. Okay, I am going to move on to hash maps. All right, so you have a lot of words that come up here. You've got hash map, hash table, hash, dictionary. Why are there so many different words? So I'll talk about the vocabulary here and how it all links together. The short story is some of the words are language specific and some of them are representation specific. So table, often you have a memory representation or a mathematical representation like a map from A to B. So functions in some abstract mathematics are called maps. Tables are used to represent in memory. And dictionary is specifically Python, or hash map is specifically Java. For this particular talk, I'm going to try to use hash map. It is possible that I slip up and say something like hash table or dictionary as I go through. I apologize. So what is the hash part? So when you store, let's just talk about hashes in general. If you've ever used GitHub and you make a commit and you have a commit number and it's like just this string of letters and numbers and you're like, why do I have that? The point is that it's a fixed length identifier and it can be considered a hash. So you have this fixed length identifier that points to a specific commit. And that's very similar to how hash tables work. But instead, you might have a key and you run a hash function on a key to get the hash. And that's actually what's in the map that helps you get the reference. This is sort of the details of how hash maps work. But it will become important later. From a top level perspective, the key is the data you're using to identify the value. So key maps to value and the value is the data you're storing. It's a little bit tricky to talk about because you say key is the value, but it's not. So key is the specific piece of data you're using to reference. And then the value is the referenced data that you're storing. I'll go through some examples in a minute. And then map is an association of one value to another, and the hash code is what's generated by the hash function. Okay, so we have one representation, and this is sort of a visual map where you map A to B. So this might be a little bit confusing because I'm adding that sort of hash function there. So in the underlying representation, the key, you pass in the key of Philadelphia, and you'll hash it, and you're going to get like this gobbledygook number letter thing. And that's what's stored in the data structure that then points to Eagles, Flyers, and Phillies. And when you go to retrieve it, that hash function's run again, it matches that same hash and then finds that value. Most of the time when you're using it or talking about it, you never have to worry about the hashes or hash codes, but I'll talk about a special case in one of the next slides. So this hash map is mapping from city name to sports teams. Thank you, Daniela, for the YouTube video for additional context. So here, we have multiple cities and they map to the value, which is the list of sports teams. Another way to represent it is as a table. So I have a key, which is an animal name, and the value, which is the scientific name. So cat goes to Felis catus, gorilla goes to gorilla gorilla, and that's another easy way to represent it. So that special case I was talking about where the hash function matters and the hash matters is called collisions. A collision occurs when two values have the same hash or key. So there's one case where if I'm back here and I say, I put a value for cat is Felis catus, and then I put another value for cat, which is, some other value like cat, it will overwrite it. And so that's a collision where I use the exact same key and I overwrote the value. So that's one case of collision, and you can try to address that in a couple of ways. But usually what we mean when collision is that the actual hash from the hash function collides. So the hash function is considered perfect if there are no collisions. So let's look at an example where we've decided to implement our own hash function and it's not very good. So here I've defined a hash function and it takes a string and it returns the first character of the string. So the hash code that's going to be used when we do the internal mapping is just going to be the first letter. So now we're going to create this map, and we can't, I'm not changing the hash function in the actual code here. I just want to keep it simple. So I'm putting Alabama in the map as AL, and I put Alaska as AK. It looks like we're using two different keys, but underneath the hash function will actually create a code of A for Alabama and a code of A for Alaska. It's a collision. So what happens when you try to get Alabama or Alaska? So feel free to message in chat what you think you would get for those two. I'm going to link the collision section. All right, thank you, Daniela. It is AK for both of them. And first off, that's confusing. But second, that's because the hash function is not very good. So what do? The sort of, not helpful answer is to have a perfect hash. When you're discussing this topic in interviews, when you talk about hash maps, you often have to mention collisions. So if an interviewer asks you, please define a hash map, always talk about collisions and always say, well, if you don't have a perfect hash, you're going to have a collision. So you should know the term perfect hash. So that's why that's there. How do you resolve it? So one resolution is bucketing. And that's sort of what it sounds like. Everything under the same hash code or key just gets thrown into a bucket. Another option is double hashing, also known as open addressing. So you have two different hash functions that are combined in a certain way, sometimes with an additional multiplier. So for example, you might have hash function 1 plus hash function 2 times the number of collisions. That's a little bit more detail than you need to get into. Usually when you're talking about this in an interview, you say collisions can happen if you don't have a perfect hash, and you can resolve that through bucketing or double hashing. One thing to remember is that when talking about bucketing, you may have to talk about other data structures, like what data structure would you use for your buckets? You can use lists, you can use trees, you can even use other hash maps. So know a little bit about how you would implement bucketing. So for example, in these zip codes, you might have Philadelphia and it maps to a list of values. So I might store that as a linked list or an array. There are pros and cons of each. And that will come into play when we talk about time complexity. So that's most of the general concepts of hash maps. And now we're going to get into the final topic, which is the operations and complexity. Every data structure you talk about in these interviews is going to have a set of standard operations, and they'll have complexities. Time and space complexities. If you would like to learn more about Big O notation and time space complexity, there is a Women Who Code talk that I will link in the chat, and it's also linked in the meetup. So when you talk about hash maps, we typically talk about get and put. I'll talk about delete and sort in a minute. So when you get, it's pretty constant. You create your hash code, so You pass in a value, you run the hash function on it, and then it returns the value in memory that you were looking for. So that's considered constant time, and we use the notation O of 1, so O parentheses 1. Put is the same idea. I have my key, I get the hash of it, and then I retrieve the value. The special case is collisions. So when we talked about collisions, maybe there's not one value, maybe there's 10 or 55 or 1 million. So what's the complexity in that case? It ends up being the complexity of the underlying data structure. So if you're trying to run a get on a hash map that uses lists or linked lists as a bucket, it's going to take you O(n) time to look through that list. And that's something we can get into at a later time when we talk about complexity of linked lists. If you have it as a binary search tree, then it might be log(n) instead. But without specifying what the underlying bucket structure is, you usually say O of n as though it were linear search through a linear data structure. Similarly with put, you may end up having to traverse an entire data structure in order to put an item in it. So that's why we call that O of n with collisions as well. Basically, you lose all the value of a hash map if you have a really terrible hash function. In terms of space, let's consider the example of a phone book. So my name's Alicia, and I look up my key of Alicia, and it sends me to an address or phone number. And for space complexity, you want to know how much memory or how much disk space or how big your file is going to be. So let's talk about this a little more concretely. If a person's name is maximum 20 characters and an address is maximum 100, and I want to store n addresses, then I need n times 100 for the characters, for the address, and n times 20 for the names. That function that I wrote there is a linear function, which means that this is linear in terms of space. And we write the notation as O of n. Again, if this isn't making a lot of sense, there is some basic math that is involved, and definitely check out that presentation. Let's go back to delete and sort. When you talk about data structures, often the interviewer might ask, why did you use a hash map instead of a list? Or why wouldn't you use a binary search tree? Or tell me how you would change the problem. When you talk about generic data structures, often instead of saying get and put, you'll say insert and get instead. So usually you don't say insert when you talk about hash map, but you'll also talk about deletions and sorting. Think about binary search tree. Or maybe a linked list or a heap. So these are structures where sorting will behave differently, deletion will behave differently, certainly for trees that are like for a heap. Sorry about talking about a bunch of data structures I'm not getting into. But the takeaway is that when you do comparisons between hash maps and other data structures, you do want to say, well, how long would it take to sort this? Or how long would it take to delete an item? Again, for hash maps, the delete is the same as put, and sorting really depends on the sorting algorithm you're using. For a more specific example, let's talk about a phone book. So you know the person's name, you want to get their address. Easy, it's O1. But what if you now are building an application like a phone book on your phone where you want to display them in sorted order? Well, the hash map doesn't have it sorted. So you're going to have to sort it, and you're going to have to sort it every single time you show that page, or you're going to have to store it in a secondary data structure like a sorted list. So this comes into, how does this affect the full context of what you're doing? So sometimes when they say, what data structure would you use for a phone book? You can say, I can use a hash map, which would make lookup very quick, but I might use a list or a binary search tree to make search or sorting faster. When you're doing coding questions about hash maps, there's a few sort of key concepts to look for. So you get a problem and you're like, okay, what am I using for this? Should I use a hash map? Is there any opportunity to do so? Or you might break down the problem and identify some traits. So you can use hash maps. It sometimes points to a hash map when you see counting. So for example, how many distinct words or how many distinct characters? I'm going to be talking about words and characters a lot because you get asked a lot of string manipulation questions. So things like, Is this an anagram of this string, or is this string a palindrome? So those are the types of string questions you often get asked. So counting is one. Frequencies, which similar to counting, but you might want to say how many times does a word appear, or what's the most common word in this document. Comparing two sets. So for example, the anagram question, an anagram, A is an anagram of B if they have the same characters in a different order. So you can use hash maps to do that because you're comparing two sets of characters. Looking for uniqueness, find a non-repeating character. Quick or repeat lookup. So if you're storing data about an object or maybe indexes of characters in a string, you can use a hash map for that. And when you talk about object-oriented design, you can often use a hash map when you're translating a value to an object, like in a cache or for, something for repeat lookup or application business logic. So I'm going to do a practice question from HackerRank. But before I get into that, I'll share the link and feel free to post any questions you might have about hash maps in the chat while I get the link for this. Feel free to work on that problem on your own or follow along. I'll go through it. If you completely go off and forget about this presentation, that's totally fine. Good luck if you end up doing that. I'll be working on it over here. So the question, slightly differently stated than HackerRank. You're making a ransom note out of some old magazines. You know the words you want in the note, and you have a list of words in your magazine. Write a function to determine if you can create your ransom note with words from your magazines. One problem with these technical interview questions, and you'll hear stories about this, is that sometimes the question is not accessible. I don't know if everyone's encountered ransom notes. Maybe they're not commonly known, but that is something that might be a little bit tricky about this question. So you'll end up having to ask your interviewer for a little more context. So to make this concrete, this is an example of a ransom note constructed out of letters instead of words. The way it works is you'll get an existing hard copy of text. You will cut out the words or letters with scissors, and then you'll paste them into a separate document. So that's what this would look like. So we're doing that with words instead of with letters. You can do a similar problem, but the words problem is a little more, it has a few different characteristics. So this particular question doesn't say use a hash map. It doesn't say please map value A to value B. So how do you know that this is a hash map question? So we can go back to some of the questions. So are we counting anything? Are we checking frequencies of anything? Are we comparing two sets of data? Do we need quick or repeat lookup of objects, or do we need to translate a short value to a larger object? Does anyone want to suggest any aspects of this problem that might point to a hash map or a different way to phrase the problem that links to some of these questions? Let's see, what's my next slide? Okay, I'm going to move on to clarifying questions. So we've got this problem. I've told you that it uses a hash map, but you're in the interview, you get this problem, you're like, cool, I'm gonna use a hash map, I'm gonna do something great. But you have to ask clarifying questions. If you look at the HackerRank problem, oh, thank you, Aja, comparing your words to the words in the magazine. Yeah, so you're comparing one set of words to the other. So that's kind of what we're looking for. Now I'll talk about how to do that comparison. If you already know, then that's great. Lookup is another way, like they're all very similar. So what would you say you're looking up? So what is your key and what is your value? If someone wants to put that in chat. Okay, so I'm just gonna, feel free to answer in the chat. I'll go through the clarifying questions. Right, so you're gonna look up a word, and what will you get when you look up the word? Okay, that's one option. So that's interesting. So you bring up a very interesting point, and that's going to come up in the clarifying questions. So here, it's interesting. I like the discussion here. So what are my inputs and what are the data types? So usually when you do interview questions, you say, okay, what am I getting here? Like, what am I working with? In the HackerRank problem, they say you get an array, or sorry, you get a list of words in the note, you get a list of words in the magazine. Cool. But in this generic question where I didn't put all the HackerRank context, maybe you're given a giant string of space-separated words, or maybe you're given the location of a file. So you want to make sure with your interviewer that you're understanding what your input is. The next thing is edge cases around the input. Will you always have words in a note? Will you have null values or invalid values? Depending on the language you're using, sometimes you can just pass one argument into a function that could accept two. And what happens if you have an empty note or an empty magazine? When we have this problem, we want to know if I can make this ransom note with this magazine. If the ransom note has no words, does that mean I can make it? Maybe. Or do you throw an exception to say, yeah, you gave me an invalid ransom note, please try again. So that's something that you want to talk about. Finally, this is the interesting part. Can words be reused within the same note, or is each occurrence of the word unique? So let's just go back for a sec and look at this ransom note over here. There are multiple S's in this ransom note, but they don't look the same. So this S that starts solve and this S that ends this, they are S's, but they're two distinct S's, which means that you aren't looking to see if the magazine has any instance of the word. You need to make sure it has the right number. So that's why this particular question is interesting, because you need to know the concrete problem you're solving. So it's kind of tricky. And finally, what's the return value? You always want to go for the return value. The way I like writing this function, so you can come to an interview with opinions, but if your interviewer asks you to return an array, you're going to return an array. You don't say, actually, I prefer this. You can call it out though. So for this, I would much prefer to return a Boolean value. True if you can make the note, or false if you can't. But we're going to look at the HackerRank question, and it wants you to print yes or no to console output. All right, well, I can't really argue with HackerRank because it has an automated testing suite, so I can't exactly say, actually, I would like it to be true, false. So I'm going to go and switch my window. And let's see if I can stop sharing, and then I will share this. Okay. So this is the HackerRank ransom notes. Zoom. I apologize if this is excessive zoom, but I'd rather have too much zoom than not enough. Sorry, I'm just going to adjust my window to make sure I'm still able to see the chat windows in Zoom. I don't want to miss any questions. Okay. So I have to rearrange windows here. Okay, so we have a whole bunch of backstory. One of the things about HackerRank is it's great to practice, but their questions are always phrased with so much background. No interview is really going to give you that. Like, Harold is a kidnapper. It's not going to happen in a coding interview. But what we do have here is they tell you, what types of inputs you're going to get. So this line here that I'm unable to highlight for reasons I don't know, but the second bullet point under constraints, it says that the first bullet point, sorry, it says that you're always going to have at least one word in the magazine and one word in the note. So that answers my question. What do I do with an empty note? You're not going to get one. And then it gives me some limitations on these letters. One other clarifying question that I missed is whenever you talk about strings or characters, always ask about case sensitivity. So is cat with a capital C the same as cat with a lowercase c? So you always want to check on that. In this particular problem, you have both uppercase and lowercase letters, so you can assume that casing matters. But we can take a look at some of these examples. So this one, the magazine is on the first line. It says, give me $1 today night. And the note is on the second line, give $1 today. Give is in both, grand is in both, and today is in both. So that's a yes. And here's an example of a no. So in this case, it's the same idea. 2 times 2. So this is the example I was talking about. So there's a 2 here, but there's not 2 2s. So I don't entirely appreciate that they made it 2 2s, but it makes it a little hard to say. But this is that case I was talking about where you do have the word in both, but the number of each word counts. So you can definitely dive into more of the examples here. So the function that they give you, so a HackerRank, if you haven't used it before, it's going to give you multiple language options, and it will give you the method signature. And as stated above, it wants you to print it out to standard output. So you can choose any, I've never used Lua before. You can use JavaScript, you can use Python, Clojure, whatever works for you. As a side note, if I'm learning a new programming language, sometimes I'll go to the HackerRank problems and just try them out here and think, okay, well, maybe when I can do algorithms and data structures questions in this new language, it means that I'll be able to interview in this language. On the topic of interviewing in languages, always just pick one. Never jump between 2 languages, just focus on one of them. I have tripped myself up in that case. I'm choosing Python because it's a little more readable than some other languages, though it does leave out a few details, so there's no return value to this function. So we're comparing 2 sets. So we need to construct those 2 sets. So we know that one set is going to be the words in the magazine. And in Python, they're called dictionaries. In Java, they're called hash maps. So I'm creating a map. This is how you define it. And so the key values there are going to be word to something. So while I'm writing this out, if somebody wants to tell me what that value type is going to be, I'll just keep going here. Yeah, so that's going to be a word, a string to an integer. And that's going to be the count of words in either the magazine or the note words. So the next step is to count them. So what you want to do is look at each word in the input, the magazine or the note, and count them one by one. So I'm going to write this in Python. So for word in magazine. Now, if you want to write this in Java, it'd be something like for int I 0, depending on what data structure, something like that. And so you're doing a for loop. And so you would be able to access this by index to get the ith word. So I want to make sure that, you know, this Python magic is not too crazy. But what I'll get is every time I encounter an item in magazine, and Python will loop over these just like a for loop would, that's index based. First I'll say, do I already have this? Have I counted this word before? So if word in magazine, that's magazine words. So have I put this in my map to count? If I have, then I'm just going to increment that count. I'm sorry, coding I'm sure is boring to watch. So don't need semicolons in Python. So now I'm, you know, incrementing the count. Otherwise it's not there, and I'm going to set a default value. Now I like Java in this specific example because you have a get or default. I looked this up for Python and they do not have it. Maybe in one of the future versions. I've noticed that sometimes HackerRank has some weird versions. That's actually a 1. I want to set this to 1. Don't set it to 0. That will give you an incorrect answer. So what this is going to do, if we sort of copy paste this here, and you're going to have to walk through this during the interview. So you'll get I've, and it's going to say, oh, well, I don't have that word. So I'm going to put that in the dictionary. So when I do this, it's basically a dictionary.put word 1. So that's the equivalent in some other languages. This would be we're gonna change this hashmap.put hashmap. This is word get word +1. So this might be how you would write it in another language. I'm just going to change this to hashmap because I again did that slightly incorrectly. So Python has index-based map access, but this is the put operation here, and then you're also using the get operation to do this comparison here, or to do this increment here. So at this point, you know which words are in the magazine and you've counted each of them. But now we need to do this for the note as well. So I'm going to copy paste, which is just going to be really risky because I'm probably going to forget to rename something, but we will run this and see what bugs I've got. So we're going to do words in note. So we've got note up there. Oh, thanks HackerRank. And add note here. Note. You're going to get some weird output if you forget to rename these. So at this point, we have a count of words in each of them. So we might have the magazine words is something like cat is 1, dog is 3, the is 5, and monkey is 1. So we might have something like that. And the note may look similar too. So we've got, these are the words I have, and this is how many times they appear.
You don't have enough.
Aja, are you, oh, okay, you've muted. So now we have these two sets. What do we do with them? Okay, yeah, so we compare them. So how do we do that compare? So you might say, okay, well, I need to go through every single word and make sure that the counts are the same. For this one, you only care about the note. If there's a million extra words in magazine that aren't in the note, you don't care about those. So we're going to loop over the words in the note. So what you could do, so one thing that you might consider is that for word in note, this is incorrect because you'll be looking at the same word multiple times. So you're not actually, it's like if you say for word in note, compare the word count in note and the word count in magazine, you'll still get the right answer, but you're just going to be comparing them multiple times. So if you have cat twice, then you'll do for each time it appears in note. And the alternative, which I'm mentioning, is note words. So in another language, it could be, so you can actually do this in Python as well. So you can do notewords.keys, so you get all the keys. And then you can do for, and this, I'm mixing languages here. For an I equals 0, I is less than keys.length, size. So you'll just want to get all the keys for whatever way that works in your language. You know, in Java, it's key set. In Python, it's keys. I don't remember the JavaScript, and that's probably what most of you are using, so I apologize. So we're looking at every word in note words as the key. And so what we want to know is, do you have enough of those in the magazine? You can say, so the first thing you want to check is if the magazine even has this. So what might happen is if you try to get the count in the magazines, you might get a null pointer exception, which nobody wants. So first is if word in magazine words. Do you need to check against the magazine words, or do you need to check against the magazine? That's going to impact your time complexity. So when we talked about hash maps, lookup is 101. That's great. So if you wanted to check if the word was in a list, that's O of n. So again, just be careful which data structure you're using to make sure that your time complexity is as efficient as possible. 31. Thank you. That would have resulted in a bug. Okay, so thanks for pointing that out. So I'm actually going to do this. Because of the way this problem is implemented, it's easier for me to check if it's not there and print no. And because printing no is not going to end the program, you have to have a return statement there. Not return, return. So that's going to say, nope, I'm done. If you don't put the return, then it's just going to keep executing. You're going to get some funny input or some funny output. Otherwise, we want to know if it's in there. So we've got it. I am so great at typing. So we want to know if this relates somehow to the no words. And then we do something, we print something here. So this, what do you think this comparator is? So if I'm going to say, no, this doesn't work. So you're saying not equal. So if I have 3 instances of cat in note words and 4 in the magazine, does that mean I can't make the ransom note? So I have at least enough. Okay, so let's see if this one is, so we want it to be greater than or equal to, but because of the way I phrase this, we're going to say if this is less than. And you can definitely try implementing it slightly differently, but it's really awkward because I'll show you how I'm doing this. So first I say, does the magazine even have this word? And does it have enough? So if it doesn't have enough and it doesn't have the word, then I'm just going to say no, and then exit my program. Otherwise, in all other cases, I've checked all the words, I haven't exited yet, so I'm going to print yes. The reason why I'm doing it this way is because I can't really say yes until I've checked every word. So you could do this where it's like you have a Boolean and you check afterwards, but this is just a little bit cleaner. So we're going to see if I made any mistakes. It turns out after practicing this about 4 times, I have managed to do it without mistakes with the help of Apeksha to point out my bug before I tried it. So these are the same sample test cases that are in the examples in HackerRank. And so that we got working. I'm going to do an analysis of this code in terms of time and space complexity, and then I'm going to talk about how you can optimize it. So sorry, my webcam blocks my screen a little bit. So we're going to go back to PowerPoint. Okay, so we talked about the solution, and we counted the words. I've written this code. I've been practicing this. It would be terrible if I was like, oh, I'll show you a practice question. I'm like, oh no, I'm stuck. So it just comes with practice. Also, I did over 100 interviews at Amazon when I worked there, and you sort of do them so many times that just that one question you do in your sleep. Anyway, so just as an aside, one way to get better at practicing interview questions is to mock interview your friends with the same question. You'll get more proficient. Okay, so back to the problem. We counted the words in the magazine, counted the words in the note, we compared them. We had a few if statements, and that worked out pretty well. This is a version of code where it returns false and true, and I actually combined the if statements at the bottom, mostly so it fit in the slide, and so I could show you how you would do that with Booleans. So first off, we're looking at space. Let's talk about M and N. M is how many words are in the magazine, and N is how many words are in the note. Why is this important? So if you are just personally reading a magazine, and it takes you, 10 minutes to read a magazine, maybe 15, maybe an hour, who knows? You want to know how many magazines there are. And so it'll take you 10 times the number of magazines to actually just read the magazines. But this ransom note, you need to cut out maybe 100 words and paste them. If the ransom note is small, but the magazines are huge, you still have to read through the magazines, and that's going to take a huge amount of time. On the other hand, if you have the equal number, tons of magazines, and a huge ransom note, it's going to take you long to do both of them. So these different values change the complexity based on how they vary. So they're independent, so you need to describe them separately. They can have different impacts. Sorry, I think I just said that in the most confusing way possible. But if the magazine is big and the note is small, it changes the behavior than if the magazine is the same size as the note. So M and N are how we're going to discuss that. M is the size of the magazine, N is the size of the note. I'm sorry that they're M and N. That is actually the letters that are used in standard discussion of it, not just because M is magazine and N is note. So in terms of space, we talked about this, that you store the keys and you store the values. So it's sort of, for every key and value, it's constant. We have M key values and N words in the dictionary. But that's not entirely true. It's only O of M or O of N if they're all distinct words. If they're all the same word, there's only one entry. So this is where things get interesting. You can discuss this in your interview and say, well, there's only one entry in the map if they're all the same word. So at minimum, you have O of 1, or at max, you have all distinct words. So again, keeping in mind that hash maps and distinctness come into play. So your space, you can say, is O of M plus O of N, or O M plus N. And that's what you would answer there. Next, we go into a for loop. When you talk about time complexity, you're counting operations. Operations are things like a comparison, an assignment, or a mathematical operation like addition. So here we have an addition. We have an assignment here. So this is like an operation that happens. This is a comparison. Now this is actually interesting. So if word in magazine words. Now, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to call this constant time. But is it really? You're actually doing a search in this data structure. Now, because we're using a hash map and you have that hash function that goes to the code, it may be optimal. But if you're doing an if word is in a list, it may be actually an N operation. So be careful when you use built-in functions to know what their complexity is. So to search for an entry in a hash map could be N, but for the sake of this, we're going to call it constant time. So we have one operation. So there's only two constant time operations happening in this for loop. And this for loop happens M as in magazine times. So that's O of M. If we think that this if word in magazine words is happening as well, and it happens M times, that's M times M, so that would be M squared. This is a lot of time, this is where candidates get stuck, is that they'll try to use a built-in function that's not constant time. It kind of is tricky. So in this case, we're considering a constant time, so we have some level of sanity there. The same thing happens for this loop. So it's N times instead of M. And then finally, we get to the last loop, which is also N. So we've got O of M plus O of N plus O of N. This is all linear. So if you add that together, you have two N loops and one M loop. So it's O2 of N plus M. all of that comes into linear because you get into the mathematics, it's an equation where the highest order is 1. That's a linear equation. And so when you are asked the question, what is the time complexity? You can say it is linear in relation to the size of the magazine and the size of the note. Or you can say it is OM plus N, where M is the size of the magazine and N is the size of the note. For some reason, it's 50-50 whether they ask you for space complexity or not. So just have that ready, but you may not be asked. Are there any questions on the analysis of that particular code? So we're going to talk about optimizations. It's not necessary in every coding question to have an optimization, and it's always better to come up with a working solution than the best solution. And this problem is fairly simple, so it's not like, we're going to rewrite it and make it constant time. It's not really possible. So one option is not to create 2 maps, but to just create one and do a subtraction instead of a count. So I'll show you how that looks here. So if we're in this function and we're just going to delete counting all the words in the note, so I don't feel like doing 2 counts. And what that's going to do, it means I don't need that second map. So my space complexity just decreased by n. So now space is only varies as the size of the magazine. So that simplifies it a little bit. But what do we do now? So we say for each word in note, same idea, if the word isn't in the magazine words, you can return no. Otherwise, you could just do an else instead of an else if here. So you want to get the count. So what count do we have in the magazine? And there's different ways you can do this. I'm just going to do it in this particular way. So if the count is less than 1, so we don't have any more words left, we're going to print no and return. But if we have words left, then we're just going to subtract. So the new count is going to be the old count minus 1. This has the same number of operations, but if you do notice, it actually doesn't. So the complexity n space is gone, so you don't need that. And instead of being O2n plus m, it's actually just On plus m. Depending on how big these numbers are, that might be a huge win there. So you don't actually have to do 2 maps. You can do 1 map. But if you do 2 maps, it's still good. So let's see if I made any mistakes this time. I always worry when it takes a long time to run that I've just lost my ability to code. Okay, so you get the same results there. So that's one optimization. The second optimization you can do, let me just double check that there's nothing going on in chat. Okay, so the second optimization is, it's not going to, get you 5 gold stars on an interview or anything. But if the length of the note is greater than the length of the magazine, then obviously you can't make a note out of that magazine. So that's kind of a cheat, in the case where the note is bigger than the magazine, you don't do anything. It's constant, and you just, carry on with your life. So those are the 2 optimizations that I had as part of this presentation. There's probably other ways. There are definitely other ways to write this, and there may be other ways to optimize. I wrote this in a very declarative format as opposed to functional. There's definitely functional ways to use it, but functional code is not exactly the most readable. So I chose not to do that. But definitely if you, take the same problem and want to write it a few different ways, that can help too. And like I said, if you know the answer to the problem, but you want to write it in another language, I find that makes things a little more interesting as well. And so that was that was what I had there. Sorry, I keep having to move my windows around. Okay, so I have created a interview cheat sheet for myself, and I'll show you what the cheat sheet looks like once we've wrapped up on the hash map. But my target here is just to have certain keywords that trigger in my head to say, oh, right, that's a hash map. And I'll have it ready right before I do an interview, or I'll keep it around when I'm doing coding questions. And so the way I've written it is, I have a definition and I have those keywords, hash function, key, collision, and how collisions can be resolved. I also have not perfect for a perfect hash. So I've got a bunch of, words, no real in-depth explanations. I also list the different operations and their complexity. And then I have keywords to remind myself when I might want to use this. Are there any questions? And this is not your last chance for questions. There will be other opportunities for questions. I will give you a second in chat. And I'm actually going to stop recording